Hey, welcome back, everyone. Well, the day is finally here. I believe it was, 2, 3 years ago, where I talked about some of the agendas being pushed by the United Nations and some of the globalist organizations. I said one of the next things on the plate was going to be digital currencies. And lo and behold, we've seen this basically cascade into what it is now. The Federal Reserve has now announced the first stage of launching a digital currency. It's called FedNow. I'll be detailing what this is. It'll be out very soon, actually, and we'll be talking about that, what that means for us. Also, interestingly, they're trying to attack cryptocurrencies now. Um, Something I believed was going to happen as well. Once they have digital currencies, crypto is going to be a threat to that, and so get ready for what's going to come with that. That said, folks, as well, the dollar is now facing attacks. There's a global movement pushed by the Chinese Communist Party in cahoots with Russia for what they're calling de-dollarization, and it's really just starting in its full phase right now. India is on it. The BRICS nations are on it throughout Latin America. A lot of the Middle East is moving towards it. Even some countries that are typically kind of American allies are at least trading in it. And once this reaches a certain threshold, and I would argue it's almost there already, American sanctions will no longer carry weight. Now, I should note this does not mean the end of the US dollar, but it does mean the US dollar is going to be one currency among many on the world stage. It's no longer going to be as it was before, where the United States is essentially like the sole main currency, the dollar. Major shifts, folks. They're gonna have very big implications for us. I'll be detailing what these are. We'll go over it. I also want to go over some breaking news because, well, something I didn't think was going to happen actually happened. Biden has officially ended the national emergency over COVID-19. Biden threw the ring into the fire, and the national emergency over COVID-19 is now over. I'll be detailing this as well. First, though, folks, those of you at Twitter, YouTube, Rumble, Facebook, come join us on Epoch TV. We will jump over exclusively after about 25 minutes, and I do an hour and a half show, so come join us. That said, let's jump into the first story. Breaking news, folks. I mentioned before that, typically once government gives itself new powers, it's very rare for them to get rid of those new powers. Typically this is how bureaucracy and just the expansion of government just naturally works until it reaches a breaking point, essentially. Then they have to reform it. But typically, once they create new powers, they create new branches and jobs within the government to manage the responsibilities of those new powers. You then end up with people having pensions and incomes, and you cannot easily just get rid of it. Not to mention the fact they begin creating oftentimes technologies and products which they invest a lot of money in, and those also have jobs and pensions and retirements and everything else, and they're very hard to get rid of. I mentioned before that a lot of times in the past, when you saw kind of emergency measures being taken, for example, the creation of the Department of Homeland Security under the Bush administration, along with the Patriot Act, which was really extrajudicial and unconstitutional, surveillance essentially, was created under a special circumstance, the threat of global terrorism. We still have it. It's still there, regardless of the threat. The FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, also created through executive order under kind of extraordinary circumstances. Mainly, it was really like a prohibition era thing, although it did play a pretty big role, and an important role, I will say, during the Cold War and fighting against the global communist revolution. But we still have it. Despite all of that. And you could go on and on the list, the ATF, the Department of the IRS, I could say. Many departments that were created under certain circumstances and were stuck with indefinitely. We can even go back to in other countries. For example, World War II, the United Kingdom, Britain, creating, for example, certain extraordinary powers, extrajudicial powers, for of course the state of war with Nazi Germany. which they retained after the war. In fact, a lot of these socialist policies in the UK were created through additional war powers, and they just kept them after the war ended. You often see this. Given this history, I was expecting the same thing to basically happen in the United States. I personally believe that they were going to keep the emergency powers that COVID grants to them, especially given it's a very key part with the elections. Now, we often talk about what happened in the 2020 elections, regardless of whether we believe there was fraud. One of the main things that was done was they they basically got rid of a lot of the safeguards on election laws. A lot of election laws were altered. There were legal challenges to them. Things that were illegal in many states were made legal through, basically lawsuits and other measures which were deemed as necessary because of the COVID-19 emergency declaration. This is, for example, things like universal mail-in ballots and so on. Given this history, I didn't believe they'd get rid of it. But lo and behold, Biden has now gotten rid of it. And now, briefly on the on the election laws being altered, I should note that maybe one of the reasons is they made things that were illegal legal. Republicans were not really getting on board with that. Democrats got on board full, all hands on deck. And that of course gave them a huge advantage in 2020. Donald Trump has now announced he is going to be utilizing every single loophole the Democrats opened in 2020, even though he's previously stated his belief that these things are unethical. He's basically saying, though, that this is the new rules of the game, and he's going to play the game. They want to make universal mail-in ballots. He will use that to the furthest extent of the law. They want to have, for example, ballot harvesting. He will use it to the full extent of the law, and so on and so on. Given this, I personally don't believe the emergency declaration serves much use to the Democrats at this point, and maybe that's why they're getting rid of it. But let me explain to you what's happening. NBC News has this story. They say President Joe Biden on Monday signed into law a Republican-backed resolution that immediately terminates the coronavirus national emergency first declared in March of 2020. The measure ends the national emergency a month earlier than the Biden administration had planned. Maybe they didn't plan. A separate public health emergency tied to COVID will remain until May 11th. So it's important to note this is not everything getting thrown out. We'll see if they actually do choose to end the other one on May 11th. But it says Biden had signaled his opposition to ending the national emergency, but said he would not veto the legislation. Now, the Senate passed the measure, this is according to NBC, 68 to 23 at the end of March, with nearly 24 Democrats supporting it. It's a very roundabout way for NBC to state that about half of the Democrats voted against ending the emergency declaration without noting the Republicans were the ones who passed it. But that's NBC for you. And then it states the House passed a legislation introduced by Representative Paul Gosar in late January in a 220 to 210 vote along party lines. Note as well that NBC is not telling you which party was the leading party that voted for or against it. What's the reality here? Well, for the most part, right? The reality is that almost every single Democrat in the House of Representatives voted to keep the emergency declaration in place. And most of the Democrats in the Senate also voted to keep the emergency declaration in place. I think there were 23 dissenters, as they note. That being said, though, honestly, good on Joe Biden for actually siding with the Republicans on ending the emergency declaration. We have our grievances, but good on him. He went against party lines. He actually sided with the Republicans, and he did something that I think many Americans want, which is for these emergency powers to come to an end, and for this entire nonsense that we've been told again and again is in the post-pandemic phase. It's the endemic. Get rid of your emergency powers if you're saying it's over. This is the official end of it, although, again, I should note, they still maintain some of those powers until May 11th, and we will wait and see whether Joe Biden chooses to get rid of them as he has stated he will. That being said, you could also understand that maybe this is an election move. Maybe he, of course, wants to signal to moderates for the upcoming 2024 elections that he's not as, extreme on board with the far left as people might believe he is. And, again, there are some political benefits of him doing that. You have actually seen the Biden administration start to take a more moderate line on some topics. And, for example, saying the Republicans are the ones who want to defund the police suddenly. It's not how I remember it. It's not how I remember the summer riots of BLM taking place and so on. But now, according to Joe Biden directly, it's actually the Republicans who want to defund the police. Given there is some truth to that, which is actually Trump is actually running on the line of defunding the FBI. But the Democrats are combining the FBI with the police and saying they want to defund the police, and that's the way they're framing it. But whatever. That being said, let's jump into the next story, folks. I want to talk about the dollar, the new digital dollar, and, CBDCs, centralized banking digital currencies. Now, I've mentioned several times before, folks. Well, some of you are mentioning other forms of election interference, let's call it. It is true there are other methods still in place. We'll see if that's enough to actually win things for the Democrats. Remember, it was all hands on deck, every method possible, and they still barely won. So we'll see. But regardless, jump into the next story. I've been talking for a while now about centralized bank digital currencies. The Chinese Communist Party was the first nation to really roll this out. That was through the Central Bank of China. And what they basically launched was a digital currency to replace paper money. The Chinese Communist Party launched it under the narrative that they had to, stop money laundering, that there were corrupt officials and corrupt business leaders sending money abroad, which is actually true. It's actually true. It's completely true. Corruption is part of the lifeblood of the Chinese Communist Party leadership. The CCP can't even dedicate money to projects or national emergencies without having every single layer of government steal some of it, to the point where at the very bottom of the ladder there's just a tiny trickle of what was first given actually coming through. It's very hard for them to finance anything because there's so much fraud in China, a ridiculous amount. When Xi Jinping was going against his political enemies, when he was purging the Jiangzemin faction, they were finding, and it's a problem on Xi's faction as well, I should note, but he was using going after corruption as the excuse to target political enemies. They were finding entire mansions filled with stacks of cash, just emphasizing how much money they were stealing. And so, of course, for the CCP, that's a good narrative to use. They came out and they said, we need to stop this type of corruption. And, of course, it's not going to stop the corruption. The Xi faction is just as corrupt as the Jiang faction. The government corruption in China is just how things are done. It's even bribery is not even culturally considered a negative thing, I should note. Nor is it in many countries of the world, unfortunately, which I think causes a lot of the problems they have, partly. But that being said, what CBDCs represent. So after the CCP created a centralized banking digital currency, they then created a global set of standards to manage how these things should be run, and then began promoting these to other countries, including going to the Federal Reserve right here in the United States, which is now launching this program, I should note, including going to Europe and encouraging them to create digital currencies through their central banks, including going to Latin America, Africa, and just about every part of the world. The CCP is trying to control the future on how currencies are run and managed. Now, you could argue there are some benefits to a centralized bank digital currency. On one side, it eliminates some risks of fraud. It does not eliminate all of them, mainly because all the money can be tracked. If, for example, you get scammed, of course, there are a lot of internet scams these days. There are a lot of telephone scams. If you get scammed and someone steals money from you, that money will be tracked and they'll know exactly who stole it. If, for example, you get held up on the street and someone tries to rob you, they can't really rob you. If they do take money from you, it'll be tracked, and it's not going to get them anything. They can still steal like hard assets, which I assume is the way theft is going to go after this. Maybe they'll steal your car in Baltimore because it's a slap on the wrist crime if you're underage, it's becoming a very common crime these days. Thieves will move to other things. But of course, this is part of the narrative being pushed on why it's a great thing. It also means that it'll be very hard for rich people to, let's say, send money to the Cayman Islands or whatever else. They won't be able to launder money. They won't be able to have tax havens. All money will be traceable. All money will be manageable. All money and every single payment and every single exchange of goods using money is going to be viewable, controllable, and legally liable through the government. Now, that has other implications. In China, for example, some of the implications are the fact that the CCP also ties this to your good citizen score, right? They have, of course, a system that manages how good or bad of a citizen you are. And as part of that, if, for example, you believe in religion, you can have points docked. You can become a bad citizen. If, for example, you are friends with somebody who believes in democracy, even not you yourself, you can have points docked. And the list goes on and on and on. As you have points docked, certain services within the society are denied to you, to the extent that you can be completely cut off from society eventually if your they call it your social credit score, falls too low. Whereas if you're a good citizen, you play by the rules, you don't believe in religion, you don't believe in democracy, you just do your job and you're a good student, a good worker, and you don't pay attention to the party or corruption, you're going to have a high social credit score. You get access to dating apps, you get access to like some social services, you get women, you get everything that they can give you, and you get you get rewarded for being a good little citizen. That's the social credit score in China. The concern is that, of course, as they launch this in other parts of the world, we'll basically see the same thing. And that is the leading concern of centralized banking digital currencies, especially as we've seen companies like PayPal, and we've seen some of the banks and other digital transaction companies cut people off financially because of their political views. We've seen the banks do this. We've seen private companies do this. This is part of the cancel culture system we have in the West, and this is part of the nature of private businesses which are able to run our currencies or our digital transactions. People can find themselves going to the local store and you want to buy your daily bread and they say, sorry, it looks like you've said mean things on the internet. You can no longer make payments. And then what do? Your ability to buy products could come to an end. And if all transactions are done through a central currency, a centralized banking digital currency in this case, you're not going to have any other options. You're going to be begging for food on the street corner. That is the concern with these types of things, that there's going to be a gatekeeper on society, and every single thing is going to be monitored through the currency and other things as well. Let me explain some of this. CNBC had this story. They say, long-awaited Fed digital payment system to launch in July. It's here, folks. What we've been talking about for a long time, it's now here. It says the Federal Reserve's digital payment system, which it promises will help speed up the way money moves, will debut in July. FedNow, as it will be known, will create a leading-edge payment system that is resilient, adaptive, and accessible, said Richmond Fed President Tom Barkin, who is the program's executive sponsor. The system will allow bill payments, money transfers such as paychecks and disbursements from the government, as well as a host of other consumer activities to move more rapidly and at a lower cost, according to the program's goals. Participants will complete a training and certification process in early April, according to a Fed announcement, Federal Reserve, which is neither federal nor a reserve. It's a private company created on Jekyll Island, which then got the rights to print our money and manage interest rates in the United States, thereby manufacturing a lot of financial crises we've seen, even though it's under the label of stopping financial crises such as that. Great book on that would be The Creature from Jekyll Island. I highly recommend reading it by G. Edward Griffin. But regardless, it says that participants will complete a training to get on it, and it says with the launch drawing near, we urge financial institutions and their industry partners to move full steam ahead with preparations to join the FedNow service, said Ken Montgomery, the program executive and first vice president at the Boston Fed, which helped spearhead the project under the former Boston Fed president Eric Rosengren. Institutions that participate in the program will have a 7-day, 24-hour access as opposed to a system currently in place that closes on weekends. In other words, there's going to be a competitive advantage to all the financial companies that get on board with FedNow, meaning if you're not on it, you're going to basically lose out. And because they're giving a competitive advantage in a very competitive industry, they're basically going to kill off the competition. The competition being, well, traditional money and anybody not on FedNow. This is a very underhanded way of doing it, in my opinion, because, again, they're rigging the game against people who don't join, essentially. It says program advocates say it will get money out to people much more quickly. For instance, they said government payments like those issued in the early days of the COVID pandemic would have more credited to accounts immediately after rather than the days it took to reach most people. Some Fed officials say the program could even supplant the need for a central bank digital currency. They're drawing a line between this and centralized banking digital currencies. I should note, They are monitoring the type of currency launched in China, which is tied to your good or bad citizen status. And they're stating that such a currency as issued in China would not work right here in the United States. Not only that, but there are also legal blockades that would prevent such a currency from being launched in the United States unless Congress were to sign off on it. They found a way to get around Congress with this, which is they're not going 100% with it. They're doing a partial system, mainly at the kind of higher level finance and business end of it, banking and so on. If they do want to trickle it down to the consumer level more so and even eliminate cash, they would need to go through Congress. And so this is not the official launch of what would be a centralized banking digital currency like what they have in China. But this is the first stage of such a currency now being implemented in the United States. Now, a bit more on this. This is Robert Kennedy Jr. on Twitter. Now, I would actually argue this is a centralized banking digital currency. They can say it's not, but it is. It doesn't go as far as what China has, but it does serve the same purpose. Right? Robert F. Kennedy Jr. said this on Twitter. He said the Fed just announced it will introduce its FedNow central bank digital currency in July. They can call it what they want. This is a centralized bank digital currency. It doesn't go as far as China, but you can't. It's a brown cat or a black cat. It is still a cat. You know what I'm saying? It says CBDCs grease the slippery slope to financial slavery and political tyranny. He says, while cash transactions are anonymous, a CBDC will allow the government to surveil all our private financial affairs. The central bank will have the power to enforce dollar limits on our transactions, restricting where you can send money. Yeah. No more $20 in the gift card from grandma on Christmas. Maybe she gave you a little more. It says it'll restrict where you can spend money, and it'll also restrict when money expires. So maybe you want to start a business, you have to sign up for the digital transaction service, and if you're determined to be a public threat, well, they can just eliminate your ability to run transactions. There's a concern, for example, even with firearms purchases. For example, There are a lot of, let's say, you know, like, for example, gun shows where you can purchase firearms. And there are a lot of private transactions. For example, if you own a firearm and you want to sell it, a lot of states will allow you to sell it. Your ability to do transactions like that will cease to exist if they deem that they want to regulate it. Keep in mind that PayPal was already, at least in the process, they even sent out an email on it, in the process of launching restrictions, for example, on people's ability to buy firearms, to the extent that they would even fine you. They would charge you money if you attempted to use their service to buy a firearm. And so they can restrict certain transactions, or if you're deemed to be a spreader of disinformation, hypothetically, looking to the future, they could hypothetically restrict your company from receiving money if again they make that determination. Some of the concerns that are very real, which we've already seen with certain banks and certain digital payment services, that are people's very legitimate concerns around this type of service. Now, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. also notes a CBDC tied to digital ID and social credit score, such as what they have in China, will allow the government to freeze your assets or limit your spending to approved vendors if you fail to comply with arbitrary dictates, i.e. vaccine mandates. That's a very serious concern. So you don't want to get your vaccine? Well, you're a bad citizen. You're going to get docked your social credit score, and you can't buy any luxury goods until you get your good citizen vaccine. In China, again, this was something we saw happen in real life. We don't have this yet in the West, but this is a very legitimate, very valid concern because we saw it happen in places where they have such systems. He also adds the Fed will initially limit its CBDC to interbank transactions. Again, if they want to go beyond that, they have to a certain extent, they have to go through Congress, but this is the first step. He said they're going to limit it to interbank transactions, but we should not be blind to the obvious danger that this is the first step in banning and seizing bitcoins, as the Treasury did with gold 90 years ago today in 1933. And I'll show you in a bit, they're already in the process of doing something similar. He says, watch as governments, which never let a good crisis go to waste, use COVID-19 and the banking crisis to usher in a new wave of CBDCs as a safe haven from germ-laden paper currencies as a protection against bank runs. Yeah, you want to get your money out of the bank? Good luck with that. It's all digital. Meanwhile, and I'll go into what's happening with Bitcoin as well. Then we'll jump into some more stories on Epoch TV, but let me just finish this. Kanekoa the Great said on Twitter, prankster Vovin and Lexus posing as Zelensky tricked ECB President Christine Lagarde into disclosing her plan to launch a digital euro. This is in the European Union in October. So the European Union is planning to launch a digital euro in October. Remember, the CBDC for the Fed is, I believe, in July. Yeah, it's in July. And this is what they tricked this person into admitting. They said that will give the central banks control over how citizens spend money. So this is a global program. Europe and America now getting on board with it. And this is what the individual was tricked into saying from these pranksters. They said, there will be control. You're right. You're completely right. We are considering whether for very small amounts, anything that is around 300, 400 euros, we could have a mechanism where there is zero control, but that could be dangerous. I don't want Europe to be dependent on an unfriendly country's currency, for instance, the Chinese currency, the Russian currency. I don't want Meta, Google, or Amazon to suddenly come up with a currency that would take over the sovereignty of Europe. Facebook is trying to launch its own digital currency, by the way. And it says central bank digital currencies are the latest battleground in the ongoing struggle for individual liberties. Without global awareness, central banks will pull off a massive violation of civil rights or of human rights, and citizens will cheer them on while they do it. And on note of what Robert F. Kennedy Jr. said, maybe they'll go after digital currencies like Bitcoin, for example. Well, folks, the narratives are already taking place. The narratives to justify such actions are already being announced. And I should note real briefly, too, the Biden administration, they want to track any kind of transactions over $500. So in the EU, they're talking about 400 euros, 300 euros. In the United States, the IRS is going to be monitoring transactions $500 or more, $500. Everything. They've already established the monitoring systems for that. But the next big threat is going to be anything not under control of this system. And yes, that means Bitcoin. Yes, that means cryptocurrency. Let me show you. Decentralized, as opposed to centralized digital currencies, decentralized cryptocurrency markets threaten U.S. security, the Treasury says. Wall Street Journal, folks. Again, emphasize they're warning about decentralized cryptocurrency. That is as opposed to centralized digital currency. Are you getting the use of language here? And they say the burgeoning decentralized cryptocurrency market threatens U.S. national security and needs greater oversight and enforcement against money laundering. Remember, money laundering was the narrative they used to launch a centralized digital currency in China. The U.S. Department of Treasury said on Thursday. The warning in a new Treasury report assessing the risk of so-called DeFi, DEFI markets says the foundation is for tougher regulations and punitive actions by federal agencies. DeFi platforms enable crypto investors to transact with each other through software running online without a central intermediary overseeing transactions. Again, folks, that is without a central, as opposed to decentralized, system to manage such transactions. And they say without the intermediaries of traditional finance, such as banks, regulators have little insight into DeFi transactions. That is the narrative that is going to try to, at least, destroy cryptocurrencies. You getting that? And it's going to be the vehicle they use through regulation to begin trying to implement standards of monitoring digital currencies that will create the beachhead into, of course, managing a future centralized digital currency, because what they're going against right now is the decentralized nature of digital currencies. You understand how they're manipulating the narratives around cryptocurrency in order to create similar currencies that are centralized rather than decentralized. This is the narrative to watch, because this is how they're going to do it, as far as I can see it. That said, folks, the dollar is currently under attack. And this is a big deal because, remember, without the dollar being the global reserve currency and printed money, of course, America's ability to sanction other countries comes to an end. America's essentially global influence, to a very large extent, at least on the business and finance side, comes to an end. And unless the United States wants to go to war every time it tries to hold another country accountable for abusing its citizens, for invading another nation, for whatever else they do that's unethical, America is going to lose its ability to enforce a standard on human rights anywhere in the world other than right here within our own borders. This is the end, in other words, coming very soon, it looks like at least, of the Pax Americana, the peace under America, the anomaly in the timeline of history which the United States represented, where a global standard on human rights was enforced by the United States. We'll jump into this on Epoch TV, so come join us there. Again, I still have an hour left on the show, so join us on Epoch TV. Before we jump over, though, we'll jump into the story, of course. Let me show you a quick trailer, because we actually put one together for Crossroads. I'll see you in a bit, folks. Hi there, Josh Philipp here. Our values are being assaulted every day by the lies that mainstream media perpetuate, and it's put our country on the edge of a knife, with no one knowing whether or not we'll make it. If you love our country and the freedoms we celebrate, I'll give you the number one thing you can do to ensure this country stays this way. Now, you probably feel that's impossible, Maybe you think the situation is too far gone. I felt the same way until I joined the Epoch Times, started this show, and saw the power that truth can bring our growing audience. That's why I wanted to tell you there is something you can do. You can ensure the truth gets out there from my show. And by supporting me, you're supporting the Epoch Times, and you're supporting independent journalism that is bar none this country's best hope in surviving the onslaught against our values and freedoms. Shockingly, most people don't even realize that almost every mainstream media company belongs to one of 6 huge corporations, all with their own agendas and demanding shareholders. Some even think it's a good thing. Folks, how can we ensure the reporting is free of bias? We can't. This is why my show and the Epoch Times is so critical. We're completely independent. Our only interest is in traditional journalism and reporting truthfully. The Epoch Times is the antidote. It's time to replace these prevalent narratives with the truth and get back to the basics. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All you have to do is subscribe to Epoch TV, and you'll get so much more in return. With your subscription, you get access to hundreds of exclusive videos, over 30 channels, live shows, events, and even hard-hitting documentaries and films that are changing the game. Just click on the link in the description of the show, and you're on your way. Thanks so much for watching me and for your support, and remember, the only way to truly protect our freedoms is to stay informed. All right, folks. Thank you for being here. Let's jump into the next story. There is now a push